They laughed at my old car. Until they saw what it was really worth and how I owned their block, everyone thought my car was nothing but junk. The HOA president, Ms. Langley, made it clear, "Get that eyesore off your driveway or we'll fine you." But what if I told you my car was worth $2 million? And what if I told you I didn't just own that car, I owned their entire block? What do you think happened next? Hey, welcome to HOA Unit, the place where power trips and petty rules meet dark comedy and suburban suspense. I'm Mark, and today I'm about to tell you a story that's going to change the way you see your HOA. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood where things seemed perfect until I made one move that completely flipped the script. Now let's dive into this story. They laughed at my old car. It wasn't anything special, really, just a beat-up, rusted hunk of metal. I could see the disapproving looks when neighbors walked by, the kind of stares that made you feel like you were the odd one out in the perfect little world they had built for themselves. But this car, my car, had been with me for years, through thick and thin. It wasn't about the looks. It was about the memories. Still, no one cared about that. To them, it was just a problem, an eyesore in their picture-perfect neighborhood. Ms. Langley, the HOA president, was the worst of them all. I could feel her eyes narrow every time she passed by my driveway, her lips pressed together in that permanent judgmental frown. She wasn't one to keep her thoughts to herself either. If something wasn't right in her eyes, everyone knew about it. And I was, unfortunately, the target of her latest problem. One morning, as I was having my coffee, I saw her walking down the street, her little poodle trotting beside her, wearing that ridiculous sweater it always wore. She stopped in front of my driveway, just like she always did. Only this time, her eyes lingered longer. I could feel her staring at my car like it was some sort of crime. She crossed her arms and turned to her dog, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. But her expression told me everything I needed to know. She was disgusted. And then it happened. "That junk shouldn't be on your driveway," she called out, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "It's against the rules, you know." I almost choked on my coffee. Did she really just say that? I looked over at my car, the old thing that had been through so much with me. She was standing there, hands on her hips, waiting for me to respond. I was speechless. My car wasn't the best-looking thing in the world, but junk? Really? I could hear a few of the neighbors' voices echoing from across the street. They were all peeking through their windows, probably waiting to see how I'd react. I was known as the guy who didn't care much for rules, but this was a new level of petty. She didn't stop there. "Maybe you should just sell it," she added, a smirk forming on her face. "You could get a decent price for it, or better yet, donate it." I could feel my blood start to boil. How dare she? Who did she think she was, telling me what to do with my property? But I didn't say anything. I just stared back at her, my grip tightening around my coffee cup. She smiled that smug, self-satisfied smile and turned to walk away. "I'll be reporting this," she said over her shoulder. "If you don't move it, you'll be fined." The nerve of her. I wanted to shout, to argue, to tell her that my car wasn't a piece of junk. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Ms. Langley was a law unto herself in this neighborhood. If she decided something was a problem, then it was a problem, no matter how ridiculous it was. As she walked away, I looked at the car again. It wasn't just a car. It was part of me. It had been with me through every high and low, every victory and defeat. But to Ms. Langley, to her, it was just a blight on her perfectly manicured street. I took a deep breath and looked down the street. Everyone else had their fancy cars parked in pristine driveways, the kind you'd see in car commercials. I had always been the odd one out in this neighborhood, but at that moment, something inside me clicked. What if I could make them regret underestimating me? What if there was more to this car than just rust and dents? I stood there for a minute, my mind racing. What was I going to do? Let her walk all over me? Let her treat me like I was the one in the wrong? No, I wasn't going to let that happen. But I couldn't just throw the car away or sell it. That would be giving in. I had to do something. Something that would make her and everyone else realize just how wrong they were about me. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about proving a point. I turned back inside, my mind made up. There was something I had to do, something I had been planning for years, and now I knew it was time to act. And maybe, just maybe, it would teach them a lesson they would never forget. So here's the question for you. Have you ever been judged for something you loved, only to realize later it was worth far more than anyone thought? The next day, I couldn't shake off the thought of Ms. Langley and her ridiculous comment about my car. I looked down the street again. The neatly trimmed lawns, the pristine houses with their perfect facades. It was all just a facade. This wasn't a neighborhood. It was a place where conformity reigned, where everyone followed the same rules, lived the same life, and thought the same thoughts. At least, that's how it seemed to Ms. Langley and the HOA board. I'd lived here long enough to know the rules of the HOA. They were everywhere, in every corner of this neighborhood. Some were reasonable, like no loud parties after 10 p.m. But then there were the absurd ones, rules that made you question how anyone thought they had the right to enforce them, like the height of your mailbox and the color of your lawn. Yes, you heard me right, the color. Don't even get me started on the constant inspections. Every few months, a letter from the HOA would pop up in my mailbox, listing off minor violations. Oh, your lawn's a little too tall. Your garage door is slightly chipped. It's not that I didn't care about the neighborhood's appearance. I just hated how the HOA made it their business to police every inch of it, like they owned us all, and apparently they did. I decided to get a closer look at these rules. I went to the HOA's official website and started scrolling through the community guidelines. I had to laugh. There were rules about everything, and I mean everything. No fences taller than 4 feet. No clotheslines in your backyard. No sheds that weren't approved by the board. Even the direction your garage door faced was dictated by the HOA. Heaven forbid you parked your car in front of your house for too long. It felt like they were making rules for the sake of making rules. Control. That was all it was. Miss Langley wasn't just a neighborhood president. She was a dictator with a clipboard, enforcing order where none was needed. I dug deeper into the website, and that's when I found the golden nugget, the rule that had me shaking my head in disbelief. Vehicles must be no older than 10 years and in pristine condition. Any vehicle found to be in violation will be fined and must be removed immediately. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. My car, my old beloved car, was older than 10 years, and according to these rules, it was a violation. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The audacity. They were willing to fine me for the simple act of owning a car that wasn't brand new. They were willing to enforce their pristine condition rule even when the car had character. I couldn't let it slide. I couldn't let Ms. Langley and her gang of petty rulers push me around. So I made a plan. I had to outsmart them, show them who really held the power. But I needed more than just a complaint. I needed something that would shake them to their core, something that would make them realize who they were really messing with. I remembered a conversation I had a few months ago with an old friend who was into classic cars. He told me that the value of old, rare cars was skyrocketing. They weren't just rusted junk. Some of these vehicles were worth more than new cars. It wasn't just the make or model either. It was about rarity. Suddenly, an idea formed in my mind. What if my car wasn't just an old thing? What if it was a treasure in disguise? I grabbed my phone and started doing some research. I looked up every little detail about my car. The model, the year, the production numbers. I was starting to uncover something that blew my mind. My car, the one Ms. Langley had called junk, was a rare classic. It was one of only a few hundred ever made. The market for it was huge. But I didn't stop there. I checked auction sites, classic car dealerships, and even spoke to a couple of experts who confirmed what I had suspected. My car, in its current state, was worth more than $2 million. I couldn't believe it. I leaned back in my chair, stunned. I had been sitting on a gold mine all this time, and I hadn't even realized it. This wasn't just about the car anymore. This was about standing up to Ms. Langley and her HOA cronies. This was about showing them that they had messed with the wrong guy. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just an opportunity for revenge. It was my ticket to taking back Coco Dentral. I printed out the paperwork, the auction estimates, and the rare vehicle certificates. I was ready. I wasn't going to let Ms. Langley dictate my life anymore, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let her treat my car like it was trash. Now I had something to prove. I took one last look at the HOA website. The same rules, the same absurdity. It made me sick. These people thought they were untouchable. They thought they had all the power. But I was about to turn the tables. I walked outside and stood in front of my car. I looked at it differently now. It wasn't just a rusty old thing. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with this neighborhood, and everything I was about to change. As I walked back inside to prepare for the next step, I couldn't help but smile. Ms. Langley had no idea what was coming. So here's a question for you. Have you ever felt like you were being unfairly judged for something, only to realize later that you had the upper hand all along? What did you do about it? I had everything I needed. The evidence, the documents, the proof that my car wasn't just a piece of junk but a rare classic worth more than anything Ms. Langley and her HOA could ever understand. But I knew just having the facts wasn't enough. Ms. Langley wasn't the type to back down easily. She was ruthless, and she didn't like being challenged. If I wanted to hit her where it hurt, I had to be smart and patient. So, I bided my time. Every morning, as I sipped my coffee and looked out the window at my car parked on the driveway, I thought about my next move. Every glance at the perfect houses, their manicured lawns, the pristine vehicles in front of every garage, it only made me more determined. It wasn't just the car anymore. It was about winning. It was about showing Ms. Langley that I wouldn't let her and her band of petty rulers run this neighborhood like a dictatorship. The HOA had underestimated me. They thought they could push me around with their rules and fines, but what they didn't know was that I wasn't some pushover. And what they didn't know was that my car wasn't just an old, rusty relic. It was a weapon I was about to use against them. The first step in my plan was simple: confront the HOA directly. But I couldn't just show up with my paperwork and expect Ms. Langley to back down. I needed to play her game, to speak her language. I had to get inside the HOA's head. So, I started by quietly observing the board's behavior. I watched their meetings, listened to their complaints, and paid attention to the little details. I needed to understand their weaknesses. I learned that Ms. Langley wasn't just obsessed with maintaining the perfect image of the neighborhood. She was obsessed with control. She prided herself on enforcing the rules. It gave her power over the people, but it also made her a target. People like her were easy to manipulate if you knew the right buttons to push. That's when it hit me. I didn't need to just fight her with logic or rules. I needed to play on her insecurities. I needed to make her feel like she was losing control. And that's exactly what I was going to do. I gathered all my paperwork, the value estimates for my car, the rare vehicle certificates, and the auction results. But I wasn't going to just show up and hand them over. No, I was going to make it public. I was going to make the HOA look foolish in front of the entire neighborhood. I typed up a letter, a formal complaint, but with a twist. It wasn't just about my car. It was about the HOA's unfair treatment of its residents. It was about their obsession with rules that served no purpose other than to control people's lives. I made sure the letter was as professional as possible, but I also made it clear that I wasn't going to back down. Then, I did something unexpected. I dropped the letter off at every house on the block. I knew this would get people talking. The HOA had made its enemies over the years, and now I was giving them a reason to rally behind me. The letter would spark outrage. People would ask questions, and once the neighbors started talking, Ms. Langley's reign of petty rule enforcement would begin to unravel. I watched from my window as the first house received the letter. A middle-aged couple in their 40s stood outside, reading it together. They looked up at my house, their expressions unreadable. I knew what they were thinking. Is he serious? Is this really happening? I could almost hear their whispers. What was I doing? Was I really challenging the HOA? Soon, the letter had made its rounds. I didn't even have to leave my house to know that people were talking. I could hear the murmurs from across the street, neighbors glancing over, shaking their heads in disbelief, and then walking off with their phones in hand to share the news. The letter was spreading faster than I could have imagined. But it wasn't enough to just let them talk. I needed to make sure that when Ms. Langley showed up to resolve the issue, she was already on the defensive. And that's when I got the call. It was Ms. Langley's voice on the other end, as cold and sharp as ever. "I got your letter," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "You've made a huge mistake. The HOA board will be meeting to discuss this issue, and trust me, you won't like what happens next." I didn't say anything at first. I just let her speak, listening to the threat in her voice. But I wasn't intimidated. I had her right where I wanted her. "You'll see," I finally said, my voice steady. "You'll see exactly what happens next." And just like that, the battle had begun. But this wasn't going to be a simple fight. No, it was going to get personal. It was going to get messy. And it was going to be a war that neither Ms. Langley nor the HOA board could win. I wasn't just fighting for my car anymore. I was fighting for control of my life, my property, and my neighborhood. As I hung up the phone, I felt a rush of excitement. This wasn't just a petty dispute anymore. This was the beginning of something bigger, and I had the upper hand. So here's a question for you. Have you ever decided to stand up for something so strongly that you knew it would cause a war, but you didn't care because you knew you were right? What did you do? The day had come. The HOA board was meeting, and Ms. Langley was already gearing up for a fight. I could feel the tension building up. Every neighbor knew something was going on, and that letter I'd sent had set the entire neighborhood on edge. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about what my challenge represented. I knew what Ms. Langley was going to do. She wasn't going to back down. But she didn't know that I wasn't just challenging her for the sake of it. This wasn't about winning a petty argument over my car anymore. This was about showing her and the rest of the HOA board who really had control. I could already imagine her standing in front of the board members, her face red with frustration as she tried to explain how my car was an eyesore that needed to be removed immediately. I knew what they were going to say. They'd back her up, as they always did. But this time, things were different. This time, I wasn't the underdog. This time, I had the power. I decided to show up at the meeting, in person. It was time to make my move. I walked into the HOA office just as the meeting was beginning. The room fell silent the moment I stepped inside. There they were, the board members, sitting around a large table, their eyes narrowing as they saw me walk in with my folder full of documents. Miss Langley sat at the head of the table, her expression tight, but I could see the flicker of concern in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. The room was tense. Everyone was waiting for me to speak. I could see the judgment in their eyes, the smugness in their faces. But I wasn't intimidated. I knew what I had, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they realized it. "Ms. Langley," I began, my voice steady and calm, "I've come to address the issues you've raised about my car, but I'm not here to argue about parking spots or eyesores. I'm here because you've made a mistake." The silence in the room deepened. I could feel their eyes on me. I pulled out the stack of documents I'd gathered, one by one, placing them on the table in front of Ms. Langley. I could see her trying to maintain her composure, but the tension was thick. She was waiting for me to speak, and I was making her wait. "You called my car junk," I continued, my voice cold. "But what if I told you that my junk is worth $2 million? I paused for a moment, letting my words sink in. I saw Miss Langley's face go pale. She wasn't prepared for that. No one in that room was. I could feel the power shift in the room. They had no idea what to say. They were all looking at each other, exchanging nervous glances. Miss Langley reached for the papers I'd placed on the table, but her hand trembled slightly. She picked them up, scanned the documents, and then looked back at me with disbelief. You can't be serious," she muttered, her voice unsteady. "This is some kind of joke, right?" I smiled. It was the smile of someone who knew they were about to win. "I'm serious. That car is a rare classic, one of only a few hundred ever made, and it's worth more than anything any of you could possibly understand." Ms. Langley was speechless. For the first time in the history of the HOA meetings, she had no response. I could see the board members shifting in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. They didn't know what to do. But I wasn't finished. I had one more card to play. I reached into my bag and pulled out a printed copy of the neighborhood rules, the same ones they had used to try and control me. I held it up for all of them to see. "I've looked over your rules, and I've found something that stands out," I said, my voice louder now. "You claim that any vehicle older than 10 years must be removed, but you didn't consider one thing. If my car is worth this much money, it's a historic vehicle. You cannot remove it, not legally. And I'm not the only one in this neighborhood who knows the value of their property. What's next, Ms. Langley? Are you going to start fining people for having too many plants in their garden?" There was an awkward silence. No one knew how to respond. Ms. Langley's face had turned red, and I could tell she was trying to figure out how to recover from this. But the truth was out. She couldn't do anything. She couldn't fight me anymore. "I'm not going anywhere," I added, making sure everyone in the room heard me. "My car stays. And if you try to enforce this rule against me, I'll take legal action. And I'll make sure you never have the power to control this neighborhood again." I could feel the weight of my words in the room. The atmosphere had completely shifted. The board members were no longer looking at me like I was a problem. They were looking at me with fear of the power I had just revealed. Ms. Langley tried to regain her composure, but I could see the defeat in her eyes. She knew she had lost. The power had shifted, and I was now in control. The room remained silent for a moment longer before one of the board members, an older man with glasses, cleared his throat. "Well," he said, looking around at the other, "Monsieur, I think we need to reconsider how we handle these kinds of situations in the future." I smiled. It was over. I had won. As I walked out of the HOA office, I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. This wasn't just about my car. This was about taking back control. about standing up for myself even when it seemed like the odds were against me. So here's the question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand up and fight for what was right, even when it seemed impossible? What was your move, and how did it feel when you finally took control? It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The HOA board members may have looked uncomfortable that day, but I knew Ms. Langley wasn't going to let me off that easily. She couldn't. This was her little kingdom, and I had just stormed into her throne room, knocked over her crown, and said, "This isn't your neighborhood anymore." I woke up the next morning to an email from the HOA. I could almost hear Ms. Langley's angry voice as I read the subject line, "Official Notice of Violation." I opened it and scanned the contents. The tone was more formal than I expected, almost polite. Too polite. Apparently, they'd decided to fine me for violating neighborhood aesthetics by parking a vehicle that wasn't in acceptable condition on my own property. I nearly laughed out loud. They were still trying to enforce the same rules they thought they could apply to me. But this time, something had changed. I had power. They could fine me all they wanted, but I wasn't going to pay. As I sat at my kitchen table, reading the notice, I could feel the heat of their anger radiating from the screen. Ms. Langley must have been seething. She wasn't about to admit defeat. Not now. Not ever. I could picture her standing at the front of that HOA office, her hands shaking as she typed the words in that email. I wasn't going to give in. That's what she was counting on, me backing down. But the more they pushed, the more determined I became to push back. It was time to turn the tables again. I wasn't just going to fight them on the car. I was going to fight them on everything they stood for. The next day, I showed up at the HOA office again, this time with a folder full of documents. I wasn't just going to respond to their notice of violation. I was going to make sure the entire board knew exactly who they were dealing with. I walked into the office, the folder tucked under my arm, and Ms. Langley's eyes locked on me immediately. I could tell she wasn't happy to see me. But then again, I wasn't exactly thrilled to see her either. I didn't wait for her to speak. I slapped the folder down on the desk and opened it wide for her to see. "I'm not paying this fine," I said, voice steady. "And if you try to take any more action against me, I'll fight you in court." She blinked, her face turning red. "You're threatening legal action?" she said, her voice rising in disbelief. "For what? Parking a dilapidated vehicle?" I leaned in closer. "It's not dilapidated, Ms. Langley. It's worth more than all of your cars combined. And trust me, I know the law better than you think. You've already violated my rights by trying to control my property like this. I'm not going to sit back and let you bully me any longer." Her face shifted. The smugness that had always been present in her expression wavered. I could see the cracks in her armor. But then she tried to regain control, just like I knew she would. She stood up, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "I will make sure you pay for this," she said, her voice thin with barely contained rage. "You're not above the rules, no matter how much you think you are." I smiled. She was losing it. "Why don't you go ahead and try?" I said, turning to leave. "But I'll be ready for you when you do." As I walked out, I could feel the weight of the situation shifting again. This wasn't just about my car. It was about me standing up to someone who thought they could control everything. It was about a fight that wasn't going to end until I had what I wanted. But things were about to get even more complicated. That afternoon, I received a call from my neighbor, Mr. Carson. He was an older guy, quiet and reserved, the kind of man who kept to himself but always had a kind word for everyone. He'd lived on the block longer than most of us, and I had always respected him. "Hey, I saw what's going on with you and the HOA," he said, his voice low. "And I just wanted to tell you that I'm with you." I was surprised. Mr. Carson? The quiet guy who kept to himself? With me? Wait, "What do you mean?" I asked, still processing his words. "Well," he said, "I've had enough of the HOA too. They've been making life miserable for a lot of people around here. I've heard them talk about you, and I just wanted you to know that if you go after them, I'll be there. I'm not going to sit around and let them run this place into the ground." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Mr. Carson, the man who never raised his voice, was actually standing up to the HOA? I wasn't alone in this fight. "Thanks, Mr. Carson," I said, feeling a rush of gratitude. "You don't know how much this means to me." He chuckled. "You'd be surprised. And don't worry. You're not the only one who's fed up. We'll back you up when the time comes." That was all I needed to hear. I wasn't just fighting for my car anymore. I was fighting for every resident who had ever been treated unfairly by the HOA. I wasn't just going to stand back and let Ms. Langley and her board get away with this. So, I started to rally the troops. I reached out to the neighbors who I knew were fed up with the HOA's antics. People like Mr. Carson were more common than I had thought. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning. But just as I was starting to feel like I had the support I needed, I got a knock at the door. It was a legal notice from the HOA. They were taking me to court. The war was only just beginning. So here's my question for you. Have you ever found yourself fighting a battle that seemed impossible, only to realize you had more allies than you thought? What did you do when you realized you weren't alone in your fight? The knock on the door was just the beginning. I stood there for a moment, staring at the legal notice in my hand. The paper felt cold and heavy, almost mocking me. The HOA wasn't messing around anymore. They had decided to take things to the next level, taking me to court. I knew this was coming. I had prepared for it in my own way, but even then, seeing the legal jargon on the paper made it feel all too real. They weren't just trying to find me anymore. This was a fight to the finish. I stood there in my living room staring at the notice, wondering what the hell was going to happen next. Ms. Langley had finally shown her true colors. This wasn't about rules anymore, it was about power. She wanted to break me. She wanted to make an example of me and prove to the rest of the neighborhood that she was still in control. But she wasn't. Not anymore. I folded the notice in half and stuffed it into my jacket pocket. There was no point in overthinking it. I had a choice to make. I could give up, pay the fine, and move on. Or I could fight back, harder than ever. I wasn't about to back down. The thought of giving in to the HOA made my blood boil. I wasn't some pushover, not anymore. I had the truth on my side. I had the car. I had the support of my neighbors, and I wasn't going to let anyone intimidate me. I called up Mr. Carson right away. If this was going to escalate, I needed him, and anyone else I could trust on my side. "Mr. Carson," I said, my voice steady, "it's official. They're taking me to court." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then his voice, calm as always, came through. "Good. It's time we show them who's really in charge. Don't worry, you're not alone in this. I've already been talking to some of the other neighbors. We're with you." I felt a surge of relief. I wasn't doing this alone. "You've got my back?" I asked, just to be sure. "Absolutely," he replied. "And you're not the only one who's fed up. This whole thing's about more than just your car. We're all tired of being pushed around by the HOA. We'll make sure they regret messing with you." It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was our fight. And now, it wasn't just about proving Ms. Langley wrong. It was about standing up to everything she represented. The next day, I made my first move. I went to see a lawyer. This wasn't something I could handle on my own, and I knew it. I needed someone who understood the ins and outs of the law. Someone who could fight back just as hard as I was. I walked into the lawyer's office, a small, unassuming place in the corner of town. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with thick legal books. There was an air of quiet professionalism that immediately put me on edge, but I wasn't here to play games. The lawyer, a middle-aged man named David, sat behind his desk, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He didn't look impressed by my case at first, but that was fine. I wasn't here to impress him. I was here to win. "So you're telling me the HOA is taking you to court over a car?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "And they've made all these threats, but you've got a valuable vehicle worth millions." I nodded, handing him the documents I'd gathered over the past few weeks. He flipped through the papers with a focused intensity, then glanced up at me. "Well, you've certainly got something here," he said, clearly more intrigued now. "But you're not just fighting them over a car, are you? This is about something much bigger." I leaned forward in my chair, feeling a sense of determination settle over me. "Exactly. This is about the power they've been abusing for years. This is about standing up to them, proving that they can't control everything. It's about justice." David smiled slightly. "I like your attitude. We can win this, but it won't be easy. We'll need to build a strong case, and you'll have to be prepared for a battle. The HOA has deep pockets, and they'll throw everything they've got at you." I wasn't afraid. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to back down now. "I'm ready," I said. "Let's do this." We discussed the details of the case, going over the rules the HOA had been enforcing, and how they'd overstepped their bounds. It was clear that the HOA's rules were vague at best, and at worst, completely unfair. There was a legal precedent that could be used to fight them, and David had already seen cases where HOAs were held accountable for their overreach. By the end of the meeting, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't in this alone anymore. I had a legal team, and I had a plan. But just when I thought things were starting to fall into place, I got a call that changed everything. It was from one of my neighbors, Rebecca, a young woman who lived across the street. She sounded breathless, like something was wrong. "You won't believe this," she said, her voice shaking. "The HOA. They've been spreading lies about you. They've told everyone that your car's been a danger to the neighborhood and that you're violating safety codes. They're turning a whole block against you." I could hear the panic in her voice. It wasn't just a legal battle now. It was a war for the neighborhood's reputation. They were playing dirty. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Don't worry," I said, my voice steady. "They've got nothing on me. I've got the law on my side, and I'm not backing down. But I need everyone on my side, Rebecca. We need to fight back together." She was quiet for a moment before responding. "I'll talk to everyone. We'll make sure they know the truth." This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. We were in this together. So here's my question for you. Have you ever found yourself caught in a battle where the odds were stacked against you, and the people you thought you could trust turned on you? How did you handle it, and what did you do to turn things around? The day of the court hearing had arrived, and the weight of the situation was finally sinking in. This wasn't just about my car anymore. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. Every battle I'd fought, every email I'd sent, every legal letter I'd fought back against, had all led to this. I sat in the courtroom, my lawyer David beside me, feeling the tension in the air. The sound of the gavel striking echoed in my ears as the judge called the court to order. On the other side of the room, I could see Ms. Langley and the other members of the HOA board sitting in their seats, looking as stiff and formal as ever. They were pretending to be calm, but I could see it in their eyes. Fear. This was no longer just a small, petty dispute. The stakes had been raised, and both sides knew it. The HOA had underestimated me from the beginning, thinking they could bully me into compliance. But I had fought back, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. The judge called on the HOA's lawyer first. She stood up, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her glasses before walking to the front. Your Honor, she began, her voice formal and calculated. We are here today to address the defendant's violation of the community rules. The car in question is not only an eyesore but a clear violation of our neighborhood's standards. She pointed a finger in my direction, her eyes narrowing. We request that the court uphold the HOA's decision and fine the defendant for refusing to comply with the rules. We also ask that the defendant be forced to remove the vehicle immediately. I could feel the heat rise in my chest as she spoke. It was all lies. The car wasn't an eyesore. It was a rare, valuable vehicle. But I didn't interrupt. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of reacting. I had my turn coming. When the HOA's lawyer finished, David stood up to speak. I could see the confidence in his posture. He was ready for this. Your Honor, David began, the defendant is not here today because he violated any rule. He is here because the HOA, in their quest for control, has attempted to enforce a rule that has no basis in fairness or legality. My client's vehicle is not only within his legal rights to keep, but it is also a rare and valuable collector's item. He went on to lay out the facts. The car wasn't just old. It was a historic vehicle, one of only a few hundred ever made. And despite the HOA's insistence, there was no law or rule that could justify their attempts to fine me or remove my property. David didn't just present evidence, he dissected the HOA's actions. He showed how their rules were arbitrary and unfair, how they had targeted me simply because I wasn't like everyone else. And then he made the point that would make Ms. Langley and the entire board cringe. If the HOA is allowed to continue enforcing these rules with no regard for fairness or logic, they will set a dangerous precedent that could harm every homeowner in this neighborhood, David said, his voice firm and unwavering. This isn't just about car. It's about standing up to an organization that believes it can control people's lives without consequence. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see Ms. Langley's face turning red, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. Her facade of control was starting to crack, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The judge sat there for a long moment, his eyes flicking between the two sides. He was clearly considering everything that had been said, weighing the arguments carefully. Finally, he spoke. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice calm but stern. The HOA's actions in this case were, at best, misguided. At worst, they were an abuse of power. The defendant's car does not violate any reasonable rule or standard, and the HOA's attempt to enforce these arbitrary restrictions is both excessive and unjustified. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The judge was siding with me. The entire time I had been preparing for the worst, and now it seemed like the impossible was happening. The judge paused, then looked at the HOA board. This case is dismissed. The defendant is not required to remove his vehicle, and the fines imposed by the HOA are hereby revoked. The words hit me like a tidal wave. I had won. I had actually won. I could see the shock on Ms. Langley's face as the judge's decision sank in. Her carefully constructed world was falling apart, and there was nothing she could do about it. I could feel the satisfaction building inside me, but I didn't let it show. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about proving a point. As the court session was adjourned, I stood up, my heart racing with triumph. I looked over at Ms. Langley one last time. She didn't meet my eyes. Instead, she was staring down at her hands, her lips pressed tightly together in frustration. I knew that this was far from over for her, but for me, it was the end of a long and difficult battle. I walked out of the courtroom with my head held high, David by my side. It was over. The battle had been won. But the fight wasn't just mine anymore. It was for everyone in the neighborhood who had ever felt powerless against the HOA. It was a victory not just for me, but for every person who had been bullied, fined, or threatened for the most ridiculous reasons. And as I stood outside the courthouse, I thought about how far I had come. It wasn't just about the car. It was about standing up to a system that had tried to control me. It was about making sure that people like Ms. Langley could never hold that kind of power over anyone again. But there was one question that lingered in my mind, one I knew I had to ask. So here's my final question for you. Have you ever faced a battle where the odds seemed stacked against you, and then, at the last minute, you found the strength to turn things around? How did it feel when you won, and what was the first thing you did afterward? Let me know in the comments. I'm dying to hear your stories.